On this week's Pep Talk, we're talking all about how to make money with your podcast, even if you have a small audience. Now, inside our Crush the Rush Club membership this month, I actually hosted a Q&A all about podcasting, which is a bit crazy to me because I probably get asked once a week some sort of podcasting question, and I've never created a resource about actually podcasting, which maybe I should, because it is the main driver. This podcast is the main driver of all of our content, and I would say 80% of our sales. So this is my first step. For those of you that have been asking about a course or a workshop or something, it's coming some point. But for now, I thought it would be cool to go behind the scenes and chat about how to make a podcast work for you and how it can help you be more profitable. So I recently listened to this podcast called Marketing Trends Explained, and one of the biggest takeaways was the power of podcasting with a small audience, which I knew and I do talk about in our Ditch the Social Drama podcast, but it's this concept called relationship-based podcasting. And it's what we do, but I've never heard it explained this way. So many of us dream of making money from our podcast and also dream of hundreds of thousands of downloads, right? But we often underestimate the value of building relationships with our listeners and the fact that you don't need huge numbers to see a huge impact with this. So what relationship-based podcasting means is that as a podcast, you can create loyal followers without a large following and also generate revenue streams with a very modest audience, which I would argue most of you listening would be like, sign me up, right? So the Crush the Rush podcast is what I would consider a relationship-based podcast. And this means that it prioritizes building genuine connections with our audience, right? So it's not just about broadcasting information and sponsorships and all the things. It's about engaging conversations and fostering a sense of community and understanding the needs of your interest. And I think this is really important because in today's digital age where attention is scarce and I would say competition is a little crazy, really creating meaningful relationships with your audience can really set you apart, help drive long-term success and profit. But again, you don't need a huge audience. So inside our podcast, you see us highlight clients, right? We tell stories, we make connections. And while we do have over 200,000 downloads at this point, some of our most successful profit-producing episodes have less than 200 downloads. And they were the episodes that focused on behind the scenes of the client work we do, or what programs we're launching, or personal stories, or even just insider updates. They were not the big guest with hundreds of thousands of listeners. But if you're still with me and you're like, yes, relationship podcasts sound amazing, like how does this actually work? How do you actually make money? Let's break it down. So again, a lot of times people think that they need millions of dollars to monetize their shows, but I would argue that we've been able to monetize our show in a way that works for us. And I would say with a relatively average size audience, right? So we've had our podcast for 4 years. We are not even close to 1 million downloads. But here's what having this podcast, a relationship-based podcast, has created for us and can also create for you, leading to more income. So number one is content. And I was talking to my husband the other day because, you know, with any podcast episode, the numbers go up and down. And I always look at them and I'm like, oh, this show was really good, or maybe I needed to do something here. But even if no one listened, the amount of content that we can create with this podcast is astronomical. So I have a content plan that I don't even have to think about, right? We talked about content repurposing in episode 398 and sort of went through how we do it. But right now, this podcast turns into about 10 pieces of content. And honestly, I could like 10x that if I wanted. So even if no one listened, I would still create episodes because it saves me so much time when it comes to being visible across other platforms. It also includes video content, which converts much faster. And to me, that's really, really priceless. It's saving me time. And time is money, right? So I can create a content plan with one podcast episode every single week in less than 30 minutes, right? So that is worth it alone. But the second piece that this podcast has helped us in terms of creating profit is it's created a community. So you can use your podcast to create a community. And on our podcast, we share a lot of client stories and wins and lessons learned and have very loyal listeners. So thank you who turn in to see what's happening. But it's kind of like a real life reality show that unfolds every week, right? So it's not as exciting as the current Real Housewife drama, but you get the idea. And the goal is that you're able to open up more on podcasting platforms. It's me talking, you hear my voice, you hear inflection, you hear emotion, than you would be able to in a blog or a quick social post. So it creates a community of listeners who know you and who know what you do and can actually feel your feelings, if that's even a thing, right? So it takes a lot for someone to listen to a podcast episode. They have to find it, they have to download it, they have to listen to it, and then hopefully they have to come back next week. So in this scenario, I think it's really okay to have a small audience, but then you can use all of this content, going back to number one, to drive people back to listen to your show. So while having a large audience helps, it's really not the only path to profitability. So I personally believe that small audiences can be just as valuable. And the goal is that if you have a small audience, instead of focusing on bringing in sponsors and talking about different things all the time, focus on building relationships with your listeners, right? Focus on building a dedicated community that's more likely to support your podcast through all the different monetization channels, which we can talk about. So instead, if you're still with me, instead of thinking about like the trendiest topic to share on your podcast, think how you can create a community. Think how you can build relationships. Ask for feedback, share a story, ask questions like you're having a coffee chat in your kitchen, right? So I always say content builds trust, trust builds relationships, relationships create sales. So really think about how can you leverage these relationships to generate revenue, right? And always, if you have a podcast, think about how can you ask questions so that people have a way to communicate with you. So it's not a one-way relationship. And there's a couple of ways that you can continue to do this to generate revenue. And the first one is, and I share this with my clients all the time, and that is share behind the scenes. So this is my favorite and something that we do really often, but like, what is actually happening behind the scenes? What are you working on? What's working? What's not working? Take your listeners on a journey with you. And if you're building something, share what you're building along the way so they're just as excited when you launch it, right? You can ask questions, they can give feedback, like make it, again, if you listen to last week's podcast episode, like make it an epic experience. Number two is show a way to get access to premium content. So if you listen to last week's episode, we chatted about what you can do instead of creating more, instead of always creating more. So you can use podcasting as an entry point or a freebie. And if you have like a 5-step system as an example, you can share step 1 on the podcast, which is a great micro topic, a quick win, an amazing experience. But then steps 2 through 5 are something else that they have to opt into. So I could use this podcast and say, here's how to make money with a podcast. But if you want to know how to launch a podcast, what equipment you need, how to get epic guests on your show, then you need to take this course. We don't have a course, but maybe we should. But that's how I would sort of lead people into the next step, right? I would argue that this podcast is super helpful and can already get you a lot of quick wins. And then if you want more support, that you have an option. Step 3 or option 3 to monetize your podcast is promote yourself, right? So we don't, on this current podcast, have a lot of outside ads. In fact, we never have, because my goal is to create relationships on this show. So at the beginning and the end of the show, I always include 2 things. One is a way to get more support, right? Which is typically another free resource, continuing to build that like nurturing relationship. And 2 is a way to ask questions. So this goes back to step number 2, which is one of my favorite resources is if you just go to hollymariehaines.com/chat, which I share at the end of every episode, you can actually ask me anything. You can type a message, you can send me a video, you can send me an audio response, and it's me responding. We have it sitting on our website. We also have a podcast page, but all you have to do is just go to chat and ask me anything. And so we have been getting great show ideas, podcast topics, questions, and more. And it becomes a way for me as the host to interact with you, the guest. But if you have something like this on your show, again, it's building trust. It's a way for you to ask questions. It's a way to interact. It's building relationships. And then it's creating sales. So authenticity is absolutely essential in relationship-based podcasting, which I just love the term of this. Like, I'm going to say it all the time now. But I think that you as a listener can sense when I'm being genuine and I'm excited. And so as a podcaster, when you are being open and honest, your audience is more likely to engage with content that feels authentic and relatable. I also think as a podcaster, it's important to stay true to your voice and your values and your mission. So if you are selling things that are either yours or someone else's, just make sure that you're not doing it for the sake of money and that it aligns with your brand, right? Like, you don't want to sell something that doesn't fit what you believe in. So I really try to stay authentic, build trust, think about building relationships and credibility, open up a conversation, which ultimately leads to stronger relationships and sustainable revenue streams. I think the last point about a podcast in general, and again, one day we'll create something to support podcasters, but remember that building a successful podcast takes time and patience and dedication. And one of the things that I have been learning as I have sort of ventured down this podcasting route is there's two different ways that you can connect with people, right? There's these like nurturing relationship platforms, and then there's these discovery platforms. So podcasting is a nurturing relationship platform. Instagram, as an example, is a discovery platform. So use the relationship platforms to get creative, to share behind the scenes, to get personal, and really focus on creating content that resonates with your audience. And honestly, it gives you a little bit of room for experimentation to figure out what works the best. But most importantly, I would say never underestimate the power of relationships, because your listeners are more than just numbers. We are real people with real needs and real desires. We can hear your emotion. You have emotion back. So really think about how you can build the relationships with empathy and kindness and treat your podcast as a relationship. And so in my opinion, building relationships is the heart and soul of podcasting, but it's also the heart and soul of your business. So if you flip the script and think about how to make money on your podcast a little bit differently, you can really ditch the drama around vanity metrics and focusing on building core relationships, which in the end, I think everyone wins.